Good morning, everyone. My name is Anne Blank. I'm Vice President of Social and Behavioral Science Research at the Population Council, and I'm delighted this morning to launch a preview of new research looking at the association between sexual and reproductive health and economic empowerment here at Women Deliver, alongside my colleagues on this panel. As head of social and behavioral science research at the Pop Council, which is a global nonprofit research organization addressing the health and well-being of the world's most vulnerable populations, I'm so glad that this meeting and this press conference are highlighting the power of evidence to improve people's lives. Thank you to Women Deliver for your commitment and your partnership on this work. This week, we've heard a groundswell of support for adolescent girls and women, and for programs and policies to help improve their lives. And we can all agree, I think, that this is a wonderful thing. But as a researcher leading an organization dedicated to understanding the various aspects of people's lives, I must challenge policymakers, program implementers, and donors. I challenge them and all of us in this room to be sure that the programs and policies we're developing and funding for girls are based on what the evidence tells us, not just by instinct or by what feels right. People say that research is expensive. In our view, what's expensive is wasting money on programs that are not based on evidence. Today's panelists will share a summary of new findings from research that looks at what a woman's economic future might look like if she has a child before age 18. They'll also share perspectives on how these findings could shape sexual and reproductive health programs and policies, as well as those aimed at improving women's economic opportunities. So let me introduce the panel. To my immediate left is Dr. Stephanie Saki, Deputy Director of the Population Council's Girl Center, who will share the new findings with us. Next to Stephanie is Dr. Niranjan Sagurti, Director of the Population Council's India office, who will discuss the potential programmatic responses to these findings. Specifically, he'll talk about how self-help groups in India have been addressing both sexual and reproductive health and women's economic empowerment. And last in the lineup is Divya Matthew, the Senior Manager for Research at Women Deliver, who will share recommendations coming out of this research and what these findings may mean for programs and policies. Before I ask the panelists to make their remarks, I want to just set the stage a little bit. We know that women's sexual and reproductive health and rights are linked very closely to their economic empowerment. Both factors play essential roles in achieving a more gender equitable world and reaching development goals. We know that every dollar invested in meeting the unmet need for contraception among women could yield as much as $60 to $100 in long-term benefits from economic growth, and that the full range of reproductive health services would reduce unintended pregnancies, unplanned births, and induced abortions. Yet we also know that the world is far from meeting these needs of girls and women, and even farther from closing the economic gender gap between men and women. We hope today's discussion and this new research will help bring us closer to future programs and policies that we know could work to improve the lives of women and girls, to achieve both their reproductive goals and to take full advantage of economic opportunities. So with that, panelists, I'd like to ask you briefly to introduce yourselves and make your remarks, and we were planning to reserve about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. Stephanie.
Thank you, Anne. As Anne said, my name is Stephanie Saki, and I'm a researcher at the Population Council, and I'm also Deputy Director of the Girl Center, which is a global center that translates research on what works and what doesn't work to improve the lives of adolescents globally. I'm so delighted to share new findings from research we conducted in partnership with Women Deliver. This is one of the first multi-country studies that explores the link between adolescent childbearing, or having a birth before age 18, and women's economic empowerment. No research has looked across so many countries and contexts. Most studies previously have focused on individual countries or on labor force participation, which assumes that all forms of employment are empowering. In this study, we analyzed demographic and health survey data from 43 countries, which represents more than 600 million women living around the world. And let me tell you what we found. We found a strong and consistent lifelong negative association between giving birth before age 18 and women's economic empowerment. This means that having a child early limits a woman's economic and financial options, both in the short term and throughout her lifetime. These findings point to a critical need to strengthen sexual and reproductive health and rights and to expand economic opportunities for girls and women throughout their lives. More specifically, there are 3 key findings from our study. The first, childbearing before age 18 is widespread. We found that it's particularly common in sub-Saharan Africa, where in nearly a dozen countries, about 1 in 3 women have a child before the age of 18. Second, we found that most women work, and women who had a birth before age 18 are more likely to work than women who did not. However, women who have had a child before age 18 and who are working are less likely to earn cash for that work throughout their lives. This means that although they may be under more pressure to work, they may not be able to find empowering work. And lastly, we found that women's ability to control their earnings differs. In many countries, women do not have sole control over their earnings. In Togo, for example, among married women, most work, earn cash, and retain sole control over their earnings. In contrast, in Burundi, the vast majority of women work, but just 16% earn cash and only 4% retain control over their earnings. Together, these findings mean that the ability to earn and control cash represents more than just earnings. It influences a woman's ability to make strategic life choices. And it also proves what we already know, which is that adolescence is a critical period in people's lives, and that early life events truly shape young people's futures. So while the issues we studied are complex, the solutions should not be. We need to use this evidence to invest in more research to understand the pathways to women's economic empowerment. What happens during the critical points of adolescence where we could intervene? And what interventions could work to give adolescents the knowledge, skills, and power to make decisions that would affect their future? The Girl Center at the Population Council, which I help lead, is looking at some of these very questions. We created the Girl Center in 2017, building on decades of work on adolescence at the Population Council, to try to connect key decision makers with the evidence and data needed to make the best investments for adolescents. This new research forms one piece of the Girl Center's strategy to understand how to ensure that adolescents have the opportunities needed to transition from school into healthy and productive adulthoods. But our goal is also to make it easier for other researchers to ask these questions, which is why we built the Adolescent Data Hub, an online data repository to help democratize access to data on adolescents. The Adolescent Data Hub features more than 700 openly available data sets on education and nearly 400 data sets on employment for adolescents. Existing data provide an important opportunity for researchers around the world to gain better understanding of the experiences during adolescence that help or hinder economic empowerment in adulthood. We hope that the findings we shared today shed light on the interventions needed to help give adolescents the knowledge, skills, and power to live healthy and productive adulthoods. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Niranjan.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anne. As Anne mentioned, my name is Niranjan Saguti. I'm the Director of Population Council in India. And I've been conducting and overseeing research initiatives on young people's health and development, sexual and reproductive health, and the HIV prevention, care, and treatment. A lot of our work is centered around finding the solutions in terms of understanding what works and why. So India is one of the countries that Stephanie has described that was included in this analysis. So today I want to share some evidence and examples from India in terms of how or what are those opportunities that we have in order to improve both women's economic empowerment and help achieve the sexual and reproductive health, most for the younger people and adolescents. Just to put this in context, India, as many of you know, there are about 1.4 billion population, and half of them are women. And at any given time point, we have 250 million adolescents. And the child marriage is high with variations at state level. For example, some of the states have got about 50% of the girls marrying below the age 18 years. So in terms of the numbers, around 30 million adolescents in the age group of 10 to 19 are married before age 18 years. And in terms of the percentage on the adolescent pregnancy, around 8% of the adolescents in the age group of 15 to 19 years. And this is from the National Family Health Survey that was done in India in 2015-16, suggests that 8% of the adolescents in the age group of 15 to 19 years are either pregnant or mothers before the age 18. So that and on the other hand, India continues to have high maternal mortality given the number of pregnancies that are occurring overall at the country level. The maternal mortality ratio in terms of the numbers is 130 per 100,000 live births, and neonatal mortality is around 25. It's well above the SDG goal that we have for 2030. So, but on the other hand, the government of India has been taking a number of steps in order to both improve the women's economic empowerment as well as improve the sexual and reproductive health. And the opportunity, one of those opportunities that we have is the self-help groups of the women. Around 6 million self-help groups, the government-run self-help groups that exist in India, where at least the 60 million women belong to the self-help groups, because each of these self-help group primarily formed as a microcredit group to do the small savings so that they continue to invest those money into the small-scale work in terms of the livestock management or other elements of the small work in order to empower individually as well as their households. So what's happening is that in that process, the self-help groups are actually encouraged to open the bank accounts because for microcredits, the banks have to do the transactions to these bank accounts. And every woman of the self-help groups, as a result, also has these bank accounts because of that, the formal transactions that takes place in terms of the finances. So that gives us an opportunity. And what we have been doing, Population Council, in this process, is to integrate the sexual and reproductive health issues within the self-help groups to achieve better health and well-being of the women. Because most of the 60 million women that I mentioned about who are the members of the self-help groups belong to low economic households, belong to most marginalized population groups, belong to the lower caste, and the individuals who have been living in the most remote areas and rural areas of India. And Population Council has been conducting large-scale program evaluations of these self-help groups, where we understood that the integrating the sexual and reproductive health messages and an appropriate messaging actually helps improve their care practices. So through these work that is taking place both in terms of the financial empowerment and also the sexual and reproductive health interventions that have been integrated within the self-help groups, we see a lot of hope in terms of reducing the maternal and neonatal mortality. So I just wanted to share one example that not only the self-help group interventions actually have benefits in terms of the improving the maternal and child care practices. What it also helped is transform the lives of the women, because when we looked at, our research had shown that the women who belong to self-help groups, about 70% married below the age 18 years. And now they want to see that generational change. They're now delaying the marriage of their daughters, and so that, and also encouraging the daughters of the self-help groups to come together and form as groups in order to help understand their aspirations and realize and have better sexual and reproductive health for that next generation.
Gotcha.
And that's where India is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Niranjan. Divya, your turn.
Good morning. My name is Divya Matthew. I'm the Senior Manager for Research at Women Deliver, and I'm delighted to share the panel with my colleagues at Population Council. I just want to start by explaining why we commissioned this research, and it's essentially for two reasons. First, at Women Deliver, we really believe in the power of data and accountability to improve the lives of girls and women. This is quite evident throughout our programming at the conference this year. And as Anne had mentioned in her remarks, there's really a paucity both in the availability and use of data and research, and this is especially true for young people. Secondly, we wanted to really understand the intersectionality of gender, and what do we mean by that? We want to understand how one aspect of a woman's life impacts another. And this time we decided to dig a bit deeper on a woman's sexual and reproductive health and how it impacts her economic empowerment. And so we were delighted that we were able to partner with Population Council for this work. And of course, this is well timed with the conference, as many of the implications have an effect on different aspects of power. So what do we take from these findings in terms of our recommendations? As Stephanie had mentioned, the key finding is that when a woman has a child before 18, there is a lifelong negative association to her economic empowerment. And we need to, as advocates, take these findings and translate them into actions, both for policymakers and decision makers, but also for civil society. And the study concludes with three main recommendations. The first is to improve the access of high-quality, youth-friendly sexual and reproductive health services. So, for example, we want to encourage integrating sexual and reproductive health services targeting youth into primary health care and universal health coverage. The second recommendation is to expand opportunities for women to access economically empowering work. Niranjan raised a really good example about self-help groups in India. And we also want to remove the barriers to accessing these kinds of work. And so the papers will recommend some examples of ways to do that, and whether that means integrating social protection policies, having flexible work hours or parental leave, or removing barriers that prevent teenage mothers from going back to school. And of course, we want to value and recognize unpaid care. There's been a lot of good evidence that's been released at the conference that highlights how this is really one of the key reasons that prevent women from fully optimizing their economic empowerment. And the third recommendation is to continue to commit to collecting good data, both gender and age disaggregated. Really, without good evidence, we can't sort of make good policies that impact the lives of girls and women. And so at Women Deliver, we're committing to building our research portfolio and building the evidence base for our advocacy efforts, as we really believe we have an obligation to understand the lives of the girls and women we hope to benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great, Divya. Glad to hear. So we have a few minutes left for questions. I'm happy to take questions from the floor. Yes. Please state your name and what outlet you're from, and then your question.
I'm Sarah. I'm Sarah. I'm from the Telegraph in the UK. I guess one of my questions is, I mean, how surprised are you by this? Was this what you expected it to be? Is it more extreme than you expected it to be? Is the link more concrete? I mean, what were your initial thoughts before you started the research, and did they play out? Thanks.
Sure. So I think that there's kind of a general assumption by many that there's a relationship between sexual and reproductive health and economic empowerment, but there might be an assumption that women who have a birth before the age of 18 are less likely to be employed. So I think the fact that they are actually more likely to be working is somewhat surprising and kind of sheds light on the fact that not all work is empowering, which is why we looked at whether they're earning cash or not. And as we said, they are less likely to be earning cash, which is perhaps more consistent with what we would expect. I think the other point that is somewhat surprising is that the effect on the likelihood of earning cash is maintained throughout their lives. So it was true for older women as well as younger women who had given birth before the age of 18.
Thanks, Stephanie. Any other questions for anyone on the panel?
Hi, good morning. I'm Ana Santos. I'm a journalist from the Philippines. So there's one note here that says that less than 50% of married women work and earn cash in all countries except Togo and Cambodia. So my first question is, what were they doing differently, Togo and Cambodia? And there's a recommendation about developing other employment opportunities. Was there any analysis on how technical vocational education might have an impact or improve the earning capacity of these girls? I know that some of them can't go back to regular school, for example.
So, I mean, we're going to be releasing a more complete report with more details shortly, so we're not in a position to go into details about specific countries, although we can give you more information about countries afterwards, the actual data on those countries. I don't know, Nuran. I don't know if it's included.
I don't think our study includes
I don't think it
Philippines.
includes Philippines, yeah.
Sorry.
It's based on data availability in the demographic and health surveys. I don't know if you want to speak to the second.
I can mention about this, the potential of the vocational training and the life skills training for the women and girls. For example, in India, there have been a whole lot of those initiatives that are taking place with the young girls in schools, out of schools, and also with the women from the self-help groups. The one example to quote in terms of increasing income is that the women in Bihar, there is a whole lot of this livestock management, and what women do is that they raise the goats and then sell it to the market. And the market, what market broker or the agent does is to fix a price that they'll pay for in exchange of taking the goat. What the trainings that are taking place for those women is to how do you negotiate for a better price? What are those negotiation skills? How do you improve the quality of rearing of the goats? And what kind of discussions that can help increase their income at the individual level. So that type of an example, which had shown a very promising result, that not only that they're getting the better prices for selling the goats, but also they're able to keep the income for themselves and the increased income for themselves at the household level. So the negotiations not only improving at the externally with the discussions with different marketers, but also the negotiations within the household. So that's as one example, but there are a number of such examples in terms of how the vocational training or the life skills training or the negotiation training is building the self-confidence for the woman. Thank you.
Yes.
I was just wondering if there was any direct link made in the report about child marriage specifically, not just child pregnancy, and what that showed, if there was. Thanks.
Well, we didn't directly look at child marriage, but it's clear that there's, that there's a link. Most of the women who are having births in many countries before the age of 18 are actually married, which is also something that people sometimes find surprising. So it's clear that child marriage is associated with adolescent pregnancy, which in turn is associated with, reduced economic empowerment over time. Any other questions for the panel? Okay, if not, then I think we're finished. Thank you all very much for coming.